Good afternoon. My name is Laurie-Anne Kempton. I'm the Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet for Communications at the Privy Council Office. Today I am joined by Alan Sutherland, Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet for Machinery of Government and Democratic Institutions at the Privy Council Office, Vanessa Lloyd, Deputy Director of Operations at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and Chair of the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, Brigitte Walsh, Associate Head, Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, part of the Communications Security Establishment Canada, and Larisa Galadza, Director General, Cyber, Critical Technology and Democratic Resilience Bureau at Global Affairs Canada. En ligne, nous avons Greg O'Hayan, Directeur Général de la Sécurité nationale de la Police fédérale Gendarmerie royale du Canada, et Anam Alvi, Dirigeant exécutif, Direction des opérations Service canadien de renseignement de sécurité. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Comme certains d'entre vous sont ici de façon virtuelle, chacun de nous se trouve sur une terre habitée par des peuples autochtones depuis des temps immémoriaux. I invite you to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands you call home. Yesterday marked the beginning of the 45th general election. Free and fair elections are a cornerstone of Canada's democracy, and the government has been planning diligently to protect the integrity of our election and defend against foreign interference. Today, I'll be sharing with you how the government will address threats and how we will communicate with Canadians during the election period if foreign interference is detected. Vanessa Lloyd parlera brièvement du paysage des menaces, puis nous ouvrirons la séance aux questions des médias dans la salle et en ligne. The Honourable Marie-Josée Hug stated in her final report on foreign interference in federal electoral processes and democratic institutions that Canada's democratic institutions have remained robust and that the Government of Canada has responded to attempts at foreign interference with measures and mechanisms to better detect, deter, and counter them. La juge Hug ajoute que les mesures mises en œuvre indiquent que le gouvernement accorde la priorité à la lutte contre l'ingérence étrangère. One of these measures has been the critical election incident public protocol, which was activated again yesterday with the issuance of the writs. Le protocole guide la façon dont nous informons les Canadiens pendant la période de scrutin, s'il y a un incident ou des incidences qui menacent la capacité du Canada à tenir des élections libres et équitables. The purpose of the protocol is to provide Canadians with enough information about any such incident so they can make an informed decision when they cast their vote. Maintaining trust in our electoral system is paramount. Le protocole est conforme à la Convention de transition, laquelle exige que le gouvernement agisse avec retenue pendant la période électorale, tout en assurant une continuité efficace du gouvernement. Communications with Canadians under the protocol will only occur in exceptional circumstances, ones that could impair Canadians' ability to have a free and fair election. The decision to communicate about an incident or incidents will be up to the panel of senior deputy ministers within the public service. The panel is comprised of the Clerk of the Privy Council, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, the Deputy Minister of Justice and Deputy Attorney General, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. Les titulaires de ces postes mettent à profit leur expérience et leur point de vue clé sur la sécurité nationale, les affaires étrangères, la gouvernance démocratique et les questions juridiques. Since the start of 2024, the panel has met regularly to prepare for this general election. They have received briefings from Canada's security and intelligence community on new and evolving threats and have had a number of discussions about the protocol and how it is applied. Nous savons qu'il est essentiel de maintenir un flux d'informations en temps opportun. During the general election period, the panel will continue to receive regular intelligence briefings from Canada's national security agencies through the Security and Intelligence Threats to Election Task Force, also known as CITE. Le groupe de travail est notre principal mécanisme pour surveiller la menace d'ingérence étrangère pendant les élections. It is made up of experts from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which currently serves as chair, the Communication Security Establishment Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Working together, the Site Task Force coordinates the collection and analysis efforts concerning threats to Canada's federal election and by-election processes. Chaque organisme membre travaille dans le cadre de son mandat respectif pour surveiller et contrer les menaces d'ingérence étrangère. Based on the intelligence SITE provides, the panel will assess whether a threat meets the threshold for a public announcement. This decision must be weighed very carefully. Public discourse and disagreement are a healthy part of our democracy, and the panel is mindful of the importance of freedom of expression. Et nous voulons éviter d'élever ou d'attirer inutilement l'attention sur un incident mineur qui pourrait avoir des conséquences négatives ou déclencher une alarme injustifiée. To this end, the panel will weigh various elements such as the scope and scale of the incident, the source, credibility, and lifespan of the information, whether other societal mechanisms are already addressing the issue, the novelty and timeframe of the incident, and the potential impact on the election integrity. The panel's threshold for public communication is high. This is important to ensure that communication about an incident does not, in and of itself, become a disruption to or an influence in the election outcome. A public announcement could also inadvertently serve a foreign state's goal to sow discord and discredit democracy. Une démocratie forte dépend de l'accès des Canadiens à un large éventail d'informations, de nouvelles et des renseignements fiables. Cela les aide à se forger des opinions, à tenir les gouvernements et les personnes responsables et à participer au débat public. Safeguarding free and open dialogue is essential. Canadians need to be able to discuss the issues that matter most during election campaigns. So I want to be very clear. The panel is not evaluating individual opinions or perspectives. They will be looking for instances of interference, disinformation, and other malign actions, not legitimate public influence. For example, public figures stating their support for one candidate or another does not constitute interference. It is considered a personal opinion. Foreign interference includes deliberate and covert activities by foreign groups, state actors, or individuals to advance their interests, often to the detriment of Canada's national interests. It is also important to note that attribution of an interference instance or attempt is not a determining factor for the panel. First and foremost, the panel is concerned with whether an incident could impact Canada's ability to have a free and fair election. Le seuil élevé pour le groupe d'experts fasse une annonce est important afin d'éviter les effets imprévus dans une intervention. Mais nous savons qu'il peut y avoir des cas d'ingérence qui n'atteignent pas le seuil d'une annonce publique. Bien que le protocole ne soit pas le bon moyen de remédier à des pareils cas, ces derniers ne peuvent être laissés sans contestation. La transparence, l'ouverture et une plus grande sensibilisation du public sont quelques-uns de nos meilleurs outils pour lutter contre l'ingérence. The government will communicate regularly about the threat landscape during the election period. We will continue to hold these technical briefings and provide the latest updates and address your questions throughout the election period. Comme l'a déclaré la juge Hogg, la lutte contre l'ingérence étrangère est un défi que nous tous qui vivons au Canada devons relever et relever ensemble. Leading up to the election, government officials met with members of the social media platforms and tech companies to discuss our shared commitment to free, fair, and secure elections. These discussions will be ongoing during the election period. We will be looking to these companies to uphold their commitments, actively prevent the spread of fake information, and correct disinformation on their platforms. The government continues to be supportive of efforts by these companies to increase the transparency, authenticity, and integrity of their systems and help safeguard our elections. Par ailleurs, les Canadiens ont la responsabilité de se protéger personnellement et mutuellement contre les menaces à la démocratie. an informed and resilient public is the best way to fight disinformation. That's why the government has developed tools and resources to help identify, stop the spread of, and report these threats. These resources are available on the Democratic Institutions website and outlined in the backgrounders we've issued today. Nous encourageons tous les électeurs à être conscients du paysage afin qu'ils puissent se préparer adéquatement contre les menaces. The Communications Security Establishment Canada has recently put out their report on cyber threats to Canada's democratic processes. The report offers an important update to the 2023 report in light of the rapid advancements in artificial intelligence observed since its publication. Foreign interference is top of mind for many Canadians. I want to close by emphasizing that we have robust plans in place to protect the 45th general election, inform the public, and empower Canadians to exercise their voting rights fairly and securely. Je tiens à conclure en soulignant que nous avons des plans solides pour protéger la 45e élection générale, informer le public et donner aux Canadiens les moyens d'exercer leur droit de vote de manière équitable et sécuritaire. We will continue to update the media throughout the election campaign as things develop. I will now turn to Vanessa Lloyd, Deputy Director of Operations at CSIS and current Chair of SITE, to speak to the current national threat landscape.
Thank you, Laurie-Anne. Bonjour à tous. As Laurie-Anne has mentioned, in preparation for regular briefs of information and intelligence to the panel, SITE members are constantly monitoring the threat landscape and have completed an assessment ahead of the 45th general election. The task force reflected on what threat activity has been previously observed in Canada and what could occur in this year's election. SITE's assessment process involves gathering insights from all the member organizations, allowing us to form a comprehensive understanding of a threat actor's capabilities and potential actions. Under its mandate, SITE considered both foreign interference and violent extremist threats. In 2025, there is a substantial amount of information in the public domain on both types of threats and on how they can potentially manifest in Canada. Au nom du groupe de travail, j'invite tous les Canadiens de s'informer et de consulter les publications préparées par les organismes membres du groupe de travail, soit à partir des liens fournis dans le site web des institutions démocratiques du gouvernement du Canada, ou encore en visitant les sites web de chaque organisme. Ces informations se trouvent également dans le communiqué et le document d'information fournis aux médias. Par exemple, pour des informations concernant les auteurs des menaces hostiles qui tirent de plus en plus parti des outils d'intelligence artificielle, vous pouvez consulter la mise à jour de 2025 sur les cybermenaces contre les processus démocratiques du Canada, publiée tout récemment pour le Centre canadien pour la cybersécurité. The information considered by SITE pre-election can also be used by all of us Canadians to better understand the potential for a range of threat activity during the election, and how we can use new and existing tools and publications to protect ourselves. For example, information we will share today, when paired with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service publication Foreign Interference in You, which outlines common foreign interference techniques and what individuals and organizations can do to mitigate the threat, could be helpful to citizens. SITE would like to begin by sharing that, generally speaking, we found that potential threat activities related to this year's election are likely to differ from those observed in past elections. SITE assesses that despite increased public awareness of foreign interference, most threat actors remain likely to conduct threat activities and have likely adapted their tradecraft to further conceal their foreign interference activity, making it even more challenging to detect. At the same time, changes in the social media environment, a variety of new technologies that assist in malign information campaigns, and increased cyber threat activity targeting elections also impact the threat landscape. Hostile state actors are increasingly leveraging artificial intelligence, including generative AI, to interfere in democratic processes. Sophisticated synthetic content can be created quickly and at low cost. Disinformation can flood communication channels, and in this election period, disinformation will almost certainly be found online. Additionally, cyber threat activity targeting elections has increased worldwide and poses a growing and real threat to Canada's democratic processes. While our country is targeted by a considerable volume of cyber threat activity, Canada remains a relatively lower priority target for cyber efforts than some of our allies. Moving to CITE's assessment of specific state actors, it is expected that the People's Republic of China, or PRC, will likely continue to target Canadian democratic institutions and civil society to advance its strategic objectives. PRC officials and proxies are likely to conduct foreign interference activity using a complex array of both overt and covert mechanisms. The PRC is highly likely to use AI-enabled tools to attempt to interfere with Canada's democratic process in this current election. The PRC is also highly likely to use social media to promote narratives that are favorable to its interests and to specifically target Chinese ethnic, cultural, and religious communities in Canada using clandestine and deceptive means. We have also seen that the Government of India has the intent and capability to interfere in Canadian communities and democratic processes to assert its geopolitical influence. Canadian and Canada-based proxies, as well as contacts in their networks, are increasingly relied on to conduct Government of India foreign interference activities. For its part, Russia has undertaken sustained efforts to build dissemination networks across social media and news websites that repurpose and amplify Kremlin talking points. It is possible that Russia will use these online networks to opportunistically conduct foreign information manipulation and interference operations directed at Canadians. Finally, the government of Pakistan could potentially conduct foreign interference activities against Canada, in line with its strategic aims to promote political, security, and economic stability in Pakistan and to counter India's growing global influence. Les organismes membres du groupe de travail évaluent également qu'il est peu probable que des extrémistes commettent des actes sérieux de violence contre des individus ou de dommages matériels dans le cadre de l'élection de 2025. Les entités terroristes établies opposent depuis très longtemps les institutions et les systèmes démocratiques occidentaux. Pour ce faire, ils ont recours à la propagande anti-occidentale. Cela dit, il n'y a aucune mention spécifique des efforts pour cibler les élections au Canada. Dans le passé, il est arrivé que des individus agissent seuls, ayant pour but de cibler des rassemblements publics. En raison de cela, les rassemblements d'envergure dans le cadre de l'élection pourraient représenter une cible facile pour les auteurs de menaces. Cela dit, nous évaluons actuellement que de telles attaques sont peu probables. I'll conclude by saying that it's often very difficult to establish a direct link between foreign interference activities and election results, which makes it challenging to measure the precise impact of foreign interference. Nevertheless, threat activities can erode public trust in the integrity of Canada's democratic processes and institutions. It's with this in mind that the CITE Task Force will continue its efforts to share more information publicly about the threats that Canada faces, as well as the measures being put in place to detect and counter them. Citizens who are informed about the threats to democracy, such as disinformation and foreign interference, are better equipped to critically evaluate information and to resist manipulation in order to confidently cast their votes. It's a privilege to represent the work of the task force members by sharing this assessment with Canadians at the outset of the election period and by participating in this brief with colleagues today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. We will now open it up for questions, starting from the room first and then online, and we ask that you limit yourselves to one question and one follow-up, please.
That's actually our determination to
Oh,
make,
sorry.
but thank you very much. But we will, as you mentioned, begin in the room with Jim Bronskill of the Canadian Press.
Good afternoon. Concerning the protocol and the panel, I'm trying to divine whether there's any change from the last time in terms of the threshold, or is it identical to the 2021 election in terms of a threshold for having a public announcement?
Turn that over to you, Al.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the question. I would say that each election is slightly different because the context in which it operates is different. In this case, the panel's threshold, as Laurie-Anne correctly explained, remains high for panel announcements. But I think what you also heard from her is a greater involvement of the Government of Canada as a whole in engaging transparently on issues where there might be mis or disinformation. So while the panel announcement remains a very high threshold, I think you'll see a more active Government of Canada response, and that response is in fact organized by the panel in their various capacities as senior leaders of the public service, but also in their mandate as part of the Caretaker Convention.
We recently saw a couple examples, perhaps during the Liberal leadership campaign. Is that the sort of thing that you're alluding to, the kind of announcements about the rapid response mechanism in Ms. Freeland's campaign? That's sort of public pronouncement?
Very much so. In fact, if you go even further back at the various by-elections that occurred, the previous Prime Minister activated site for the last 12 or 13 by-elections. And in that process, you saw instances where the government stepped forward and called out different types of foreign interference. Again, during the Liberal leadership, where the site was again activated, you saw again a public announcement of an example of foreign interference. This is really an example that we hope has test run the approach that we'll use for this election.
Melanie Marquis.
Oui, bonjour. Je commence avec la question évidente, celle d'Elon Musk, propriétaire et allié proche de Donald Trump. Avez-vous déjà détecté des pistes qui pourraient vous porter à croire qu'il y a de l'ingérence de sa part? Puis quel message avez-vous pour lui, puis pour les patrons de réseaux sociaux en général?
Peut-être je pourrais commencer et j'inviterai Al et Larisa à contribuer s'il veut. Monsieur Musk ou n'importe qui publie sous son nom ou avec des postes attribués à eux-mêmes ne répond pas à la définition de l'ingérence à l'étrangère. Si Al ou Larisa, voulez-vous ajouter quelque chose d'autre?
Yeah, so your example is a very timely one. Obviously, Mr. Musk has a considerable following not just in Canada, but throughout the world. It's an expression of his personal opinion. It's definitely not clandestine. It's very public by its very nature. And, you know, Canadians will have an opportunity to judge his or anyone else's opinions as expressed throughout the election campaign. And so our trust is with Canadians that they can separate what is truthful and what may not be truthful, and what should be listened to and what should be ignored.
Oui, je suis tout à fait consciente que le simple fait pour lui de s'exprimer ne représente pas de l'ingérence électorale, mais c'est quand même lui qui contrôle l'algorithme. Est-ce que, je répète un peu ma question, est-ce que vous avez détecté peut-être des indices qui vous portent à croire qu'il y a une manipulation de l'algorithme pour tenter de s'ingérer, de faire passer ces messages à lui?
Vanessa?
Thank you.
I don't think,
Where?
I think it will just turn on.
I think it will just turn on. Is it on? Yes. When we see online activity that has the markings of inauthentic behavior or manipulated, that something is manipulated, we will, from at the rapid response mechanism in Canada, our analysts are able to look at the data behind the social media posts, the social media activity, to see what it's connected to and what it's linked to. And if we see the markers of a foreign-backed, in particular a state-backed campaign, in, we will flag that through the mechanisms that both Laurie and Vanessa have described. And we watch all the platforms that you can think of.
You ready?
Yeah, my question was going to be actually about that as well, specifically about the platform X. Is there any strategy to tackle with the bots? And because that's one big source of spreading disinformation specifically. And how do you hope Canadians to kind of make a difference between fake profiles and bots on social media platforms?
So there are a variety of approaches that are undertaken and have been undertaken. For instance, the Government of Canada has funded for some years now the Canadian Digital Media Research Networks, which is an independent network of Canadian think tanks that looks at issues such as bots. In fact, they had a year ago last summer, there was the Kirkland Lake incident, which was an example of the use of bots to amplify a presentation by one of the political leaders. And they identified it correctly and identified that, in fact, there was a bit of amplification that had taken place. It wasn't a particularly meaningful or substantive amplification, but they were able to detect it. This network is now a year older. It has some 10 think tanks and academic institutions tied to it, with more joining as affiliates. And it will be independently of the government be looking at issues such as the one you raised about the use of bots to amplify. And if I could just take a step back, keep in mind that this is not a uniquely Canadian phenomenon. This is something that affects democracies around the world. And as Laurie-Anne, I think, mentioned, Canada is not, in fact, at the very front lines of this issue. So just as all other democracies have had, significant democratic events that have had integrity over the last year or so, including many of our allies, there's every reason to believe Canada will as well.
Al is correct that we're very lucky in Canada to have a growing civil society becoming increasingly active in identifying foreign interference and other malign activity online. But there was also made reference to materials that have been circulated today, and how what Canadians can know to help themselves understand what's out there. There's really good tips on what to look for and how to identify suspicious behavior. And so I think that a part of the objective today is to spread those tips and tricks so that we as Canadians can be better informed consumers of all the information that is out there.
Thank you so much. I just had one more question. Do you see any threats from far-right groups in the US to interfere in Canada's election, like the MAGA group?
Vanessa?
Thank you for the question. So the site task force and all of its members will continue to monitor the election and any instances of potential foreign interference throughout it. We will look at it from the perspective of foreign interference and violent extremist groups. And in cases where those might intersect, they would certainly come to the attention of our members.
Chris Nardi.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you for doing this. I've heard it's going to be regular, and it's much appreciated. We rarely have top experts just sitting in front of us, so I really appreciate it. My first question is about the recommendations in the Hogue Inquiry report. Obviously, we'll set aside any that required legislative changes, considering the timing, but which, if any, of the recommendations that didn't require legislative changes do you know of that the government has implemented before this election was launched yesterday?
So maybe I'll start and I'll invite you to join in. Yeah. So some of the ones that we've undertaken right away relate to the communications, and so Justice O recommended we be more forthcoming and more public, and so the panel has done that, and we are doing that through these briefings. Al, are there other recommendations you'd like to speak to?
Yeah, well, you just mentioned the big one, which is increased communications. That's was a prominent theme in the OG report. Other things that she identified that the government has already acted on include things like open source intelligence gathering, which was activated almost immediately after her report with substantial funding increase to the rapid response mechanism, and really an expansion of their mandate so that they could look at the Canadian information scene in a deeper way. That those resources are in place. Similarly, there were recommendations around enforcement of, say, Elections Canada's and the Commission of Canada election legislation. A large input of resources occurred there. Elections Canada got some $44 million over 5 years just to enhance its enforcement capabilities. So that's really the downstream of some of the concerns around, like if you have an issue where you think there's been foreign interference, well, you have to enforce it, and then now we're in a better position to enforce it. So that's an example. I would say, too, that just the changing protocols of the panel are very consistent with the Hogue recommendations. The panel, as Laurie-Anne mentioned, has been in operation now for a year and a half. It's far more established than it was in the last 2 elections. So that is also an example of where there have been improvements. I mean, generally, Justice Hogue's mission of providing a thoughtful report and informing Canadians has been a really important contribution of it in its own right, informing Canadians about their central role. And that's what this conversation is all about as well. So I think that her 51 recommendations are still being ingested by the public service, and there are more recommendations. As you correctly said, some may require legislation, some take a little longer to implement, but we've certainly moved on the ones that we can.
And in terms of site disclosures in particular, you mentioned to Mr. Bronskill that one that we'd seen during, for example, the Liberal leadership campaign could be an example going forward. Now, one could argue that that disclosure was very, very vague and had very little information that ultimately might have cast more aspersion on legitimately content because we had no idea where it was, apart from what platform, what it was about, apart from Ms. Freeland. There was so much that we didn't know. And I'll contrast it to maybe 2 weeks later, Ms. Galadza's RRM put out an incredibly detailed RRM report on the apparent Chinese botnet that had links to content, that had details about what they were spreading, who was spreading it, how to find it, and was ultimately, I would argue, much, much more helpful. So which one are we leaning towards, and will you commit to more disclosure than the one that we saw on Ms. Freeland that a lot of people just told me, we don't even know what we're looking for to be concerned about?
So maybe I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Larisa and Vanessa. I think, we want to be as transparent as possible, mindful of there are lots of underpinning things in terms of intelligence that will kind of frame what that transparency is like. It was Larissa's team that did the great work around Ms. Freeland, but maybe Vanessa, I don't know if there's something you want to say, and then Larisa, if you want to add in.
I think what I would add is that where we started our conversation. So the ideal is to be able to pair any of the statements that we make with the tools and techniques that Canadians can apply themselves to be able to evaluate information before them. So I think if there's a takeaway from today, it is really to emphasize how much information the Government of Canada has put out, that it will enable us all to critically evaluate information before us. From the site perspective, we are certainly aware that proactive and effective information sharing is a really critical element of national security and ensuring our democratic processes. So you will find us, as I said earlier, forward-leaning over the course of the election period to try to share as much information as possible. That said, as Laurie mentioned, we need to also keep in mind that national security is paramount. So that does mean that we will not be able to share all information, because we will not share information that, were it to be revealed, could cause injury to national security. Similarly, if we will need to balance the sharing of information with the inadvertent amplification of things that are perhaps having little to minimal impact. And that's probably a good place to hand it over to Larisa.
Thank you. I think you've raised two very good examples, but also examples of where we are still calibrating the right level of detail. It is of utmost importance that our products and our communication with Canadians have credibility. And so we take your comments on board, and this is a team effort that is continuously calibrating the information that we will be proactively putting out to Canadians to inform all of us, and we will, and that has to be done in the context, and each case will be a different context. So that's what governs what will inform our public communications.
If I can pop in as well too, part of it is about those announcements and statements that are made if there is an issue identified. But the other part, and to point to what Vanessa had mentioned about being proactive with information, it's about providing information to all of us who are voters and consuming that information online. And so in the Threats to Democratic Process update that we in the Cyber Center put out, talked a lot about the role artificial intelligence has to play in a lot of these botnets, etc. So trying to get information out proactively so that everyone is informed to make good decisions when they're consuming information online.
We are going to move over to the online portion of the Q&A, but before we do that, I will use my privilege to ask a question from the floor. One of the vulnerabilities that was discussed at length during the OAG Commission was messenger apps and the inability of our security apparatus to tap in either to foreign language messenger apps or just even the ones, Canadians might use in English and French. Has there been any change in that posture? Like any greater visibility? Have you spoken to the folks who run WeChat about trying to solve for that a little bit?
Do you want to start us off and then maybe Brigitte?
Sure. So we have had conversations with Tencent, which is an affiliate organization of WeChat. And so part of what we've done is we've established that information link with them, and they were part of the exchange on the matter that Larisa described in more detail with Ms. Freeland. And so we do have ongoing discussions with them. They occur both bilaterally and in a multilateral context with other social media platforms. On your specific issue, I mean, we have had a few discussions on that particular point, but there's nothing that we have to announce here today.
Anybody else want to add into that?
I would just say that we do have the linguistic capacity to look at messenger apps in different languages. So that's part of you're absolutely right that those there are a lot of consumers in Canada of messenger apps that are actually foreign based. So we have enhanced our capacity to do that for GE45.
But I think the Canadians' expectations would be that those apps are private, though. So maybe can you clarify? Like, are you spying on people's DMs on Instagram, or?
There are messenger apps that have newsrooms that are open, and then at a certain point they become closed. We stay at the rapid response mechanism. We're only looking at open source social media.
Okay, we'll move online. We'll begin with Nicole Williams from CBC. Just hold on one second. I will allow you to talk. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if the panel can first confirm whether or not the Liberals' disqualifying of Chandra Arya had anything to do with concerns of foreign interference.
Vanessa,
or any of the tickets that you or notices from bylaw?
I'm not quite sure who was talking just there. Nicole, we heard the end of your question.
Yeah. So
okay.
That's good.
I'm not sure if that's, I'm going to mute myself so that someone can answer.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Certainly the Government of Canada takes foreign interference and its potential serious in any context. And this is why in January, the Deputy Clerk and National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister identified that site would be stood up for the purposes of monitoring the Liberal leadership race. Of course, the leadership campaigns are entirely within the purview of the party. However, they are part of a critical continuum of democratic process activity. So site was stood up on the 27th of January, the day that the candidates were determined by the party, and ran our enhanced monitoring, until actually the 16th of March, a week after the determination of the new leader on March 9th. What I would emphasize there is that throughout the period, the site members had the opportunity to provide classified and unclassified briefs to the Liberal Party in terms of the activity that we saw during that campaign period between the 27th of January and the end of the campaign.
Thank you so much. I'm also wondering if you can speak to whether or not your panel is looking into the comments made by Alberta Premier Danielle Smith on Breitbart. There's speculation, or there's concerns that her suggesting the U.S. administration put tariff talks on pause as potential a potential request by the U.S. to interfere in Canada's elections outcome. I'm wondering if you can comment whether or not that's something your panel is investigating.
Thank you for the question. I think we can say that we're aware of Premier Smith's comments, but that they don't meet the definition of interference, and so we are not looking into them.
And we'll move on to what's going to be our last question of this news conference. Janice McGregor, CBC.
Hi, thanks everyone. A question about the threshold for reporting an incident. You talked about this a little bit. I just want to try and get some more clarity from you on this point. During the inquiry, it was obviously raised the issue of whether something had to be national in scope, or whether we could have an incident at a single riding level that was serious enough that it should be triggering public statements, such that sort of maybe it doesn't sway what party wins, but it might sway who the MP is for a given seat, and that is unacceptable as well. You were sort of talking about how your thinking has changed, how the protocol's been refined given what you learned at the inquiry, but could we now see a warning that is just about something happening in one riding? Your criteria, if you could just lean into it a little bit more and describe it in more detail. I think it's important for people to understand how you've adjusted this threshold based on what the inquiry said.
Yeah, happy to. It's important to distinguish between a panel announcement, which is triggered when something threatens the integrity of the election, and you correctly laid down kind of the polar range, the poles in the range of that. It could be a very impactful level of interference in a single riding, or indeed it could be national. But if it's those sorts of things that threaten the integrity of the election, whether it's in one or just a handful of ridings or across the country, could be something that in the panel's judgment, in their nuanced judgment, requires them to initiate the protocol. And if that were to happen, they would make an announcement to Canadians. At that announcement, they would do a couple of things. They would explain what has happened to the best of their ability, subject to some of the national security concerns that you heard. We're never going to put our human assets at risk, and we're not going to kind of undermine our national security through the announcement. But they will tell Canadians what they can about what has happened, and they will also try to help Canadians understand what they can do to avoid being impacted. So that's the classic panel announcement, and just to be clear, it has never been triggered because it's never had to have been triggered, which is a great thing for Canadian democracy. So as Justice Hogue found in 2019 and 2021, there was no need for the panel to step forward. What Justice Hogue went on to do, and what is impacting kind of what you'll see this time in the 2025 election, is the need to perhaps be a little more proactive in calling out smaller instances, less impactful instances of perhaps mis and disinformation, And the idea is, that transparency is the best sunlight, that this is something that helps Canadians make an informed decision, and that together with the other reports, whether it's the Hogue report, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report, the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency report, or we've got the CSIS and CSE reports, that together Canadians can get a fuller picture of mis and disinformation and can properly understand that, they are potentially impacted, and to understand when that impact occurs, how they can protect themselves by not sharing this information and not allowing it to impact their vote, so that Canadians' elections remain for Canadians.
So just to be clear then, it is possible that you would trigger the protocol and make a public statement for a single riding this time. The threshold is no longer that this has to be an event national in scope.
I don't know that that's an actual change. Previous panelists had said that had a single riding been deeply impacted, that would have been enough to trigger the protocol.
I'm just going to ask a final follow-up for clarity on the Chandra Arya element, because it's unclear to me whether you're saying there was a direct linkage between information that site provided to the party and Mr. Arya's disqualification, or you're not commenting on that element of it whatsoever.
Thank you for the request for clarification. So my point was to share with you that the site monitored the Liberal leadership race from when it started, when the candidates were approved by the party, until the end of the campaign, and that we engage with the party in order to be able to share with them information that is helpful for those campaign teams to be alert to instances of foreign interference. And so the types of briefing that we offered to the campaign teams were related to, as we've discussed today, an awareness of the threat landscape, how candidates could protect themselves, and also importantly that we've not touched on today, how to be able to report events that are possibly foreign interference or threats of violent extremism to site. And it's really important to have that two-way communication channel between parties, and it was in place for the leadership race for the first time, and will of course be in place for the general election, as we will establish communication channels with all of the parties through cleared representatives during the course of the general election campaign.
We look forward to future exchanges such as this, and with that we will come to the end of today's press conference. Thank you very much. Merci à tous.